Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next podcast episode, VIP Vanguard Indo-Pacific at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. And today I'm joined with my fellow member, Arushi Singh. And today we are honored to have an exemplary and expert and speaker, Professor Ellis. Let me introduce him briefly here. And for our today's discussion that is focused on China and Latin America and what's the implication for the United States in the region. So our topic is cost and benefit and analysis of China's investment in Latin America. We welcome you, Professor Ellis, here. Professor Ellis is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Study Institute with a focus on the region's relationship with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. Dr. Ellis has published over 400 books, including 5 books, the 2009 book, China in Latin America, the What's and Wherefores, the 2013 book, The Strategic Dimension of Chinese Engagement with Latin America, the 2014 book, China on the Ground in Latin America, the 2018 book, Transnational Organized Crime in Latin America and the Caribbean, and he published the recent book on China's engagement in Latin America, Distorting Development and Democracy. Professor Ellis previously served as Secretary of State Policy Planning with the responsibility of Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the international narcotics and law enforcement issues. Professor Ellis has also been awarded the Order of Military by the Colombian government for his scholarship on security issues in the region. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Ellis. I would like to start with a trending question that is more a kind of important with the, and recently Secretary Blinken visited China. He raised the issue with the president and other Chinese authorities there. It's the fentanyl issues, like how much is badly impacted the United States, as the report says that with the age group of 15 to 49 age group youths are badly impacted of this synthetic opioid, and the primary sources of this is China, that is trafficking towards Mexico and coming to the United States border. So I want to ask, I'm curious that how much important this concern is, and rather than the geopolitics issue that we are facing in the great power politics in the Indo-Pacific or the Taiwan Strait. So how much is concerning, and what's your take here?
Well, I appreciate the question, Indu, and it's a pleasure to be on the podcast with you and your colleague. So first of all, this is an example of how so many issues with our global interconnectivity are both domestic issues of domestic importance as well as international issues. And we certainly see that with immigration as well, and we certainly see that with drugs. In terms of the overall impact, especially with synthetic drugs, but especially with fentanyl, I believe last year something like 109,000 people died in the United States of overdoses, and about 70% of those were overdoses of fentanyl, just because of the potency. It's so very easy for impure or otherwise badly prepared illicit drugs to kill through overdoses. The fentanyl issue and the drug issue in general, especially coming out of places like Wuhan, has been on the table with China for several different years. I remember it was a point of discussion when, again, I was on Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's policy planning staff during the previous administration, and had the privilege of working with our State Department organization for international narcotics and law enforcement. And I will say that my experience is that the Chinese do work with us to some degree. They have a shared interest in controlling drug flows both in China and in other places. It impacts their reputation as well as impacting China domestically. However, I can't say that that cooperation has always been very extensive. Sometimes it's reluctant, and especially the Chinese don't like to admit when they have difficulties. Frankly, it's also a very difficult issue for them to control, since there are literally thousands of different chemical producers within China, and also many different basically chemical receipts for things other than the ones that are explicitly controlled. And so it is a difficult problem, and yet at the same time, when you look at China's ability to, for example, impose internet controls on 1.4 million Chinese, it's saying it's a difficult problem doesn't mean that they can't do it. My experience has been that yes, when we apply enough pressure, they will do some cooperation. Indeed, in part, getting the fentanyl away from direct mailing from Wuhan to the United States was one of the accomplishments. However, a lot of the fentanyl then began going to Mexico even more than previously. And some of the cartels in Mexico, especially the ones who have long time had Asia ties, especially Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación, began using those ties to essentially bring the precursor chemicals in and set up fentanyl in other synthetic pill presses in Mexico, and then bring it into the United States, that way. So it did make sense that this was an issue because of the number of Americans who have been killed in the other countries it touches on. And we are getting some cooperation, I think. And frankly, with the many different issues that have created tensions between the US and China, this is probably one where we could have some type of constructive engagement. So I suspect that's one of the reasons why it was on Secretary Blinken's agenda there in Beijing.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ellis. I'm taking a short question from whatever you said here. So recently, Justice Department announced charges against China-based chemical manufacturing companies. So how do you see that this pressure or these charges will hamper the effort that United States is doing, like in the visit of the Secretary Blinken, in stabilizing the relation with U.S.-China?
Well, I think the most important thing is that does show that our Department of Justice does have concrete information that is actionable in U.S. courts about specific, Chinese fentanyl producers. And so it's not just politics. Now, although it's not entirely clear the role of China, whether they cooperated or not, certainly this was an arrest on U.S. soil and not an arrest in China. And at least from what I've seen, there was not public evidence that the Chinese were helping us in getting that evidence that they needed on Chinese companies. And so there's probably a lot more that needs to be done. But if nothing else, and frankly, this will, again, probably be a drop in the bucket in terms of the large number of different chemical suppliers in China. But at the end of the day, the most important thing for me is I think it provides concrete evidence that there is legally actionable evidence that that this fentanyl is being produced in China and it's being brought over into the United States through these, Chinese business intermediaries.
Yeah, thank you. Anushi, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, thank you so much for that illuminating answer, Dr. Ellis. We are delighted to have you today with us. So, a lot of contemporary literature has been saying China's engagement with the variety, with the diverse countries of Latin America. But this relationship has primarily been driven by economic and security interests. However, this unique partnership and these linkages, they are encountering fresh difficulties as the struggling region grapples with increasingly severe economic and public health crisis. So my question is, we have to understand these issues better. To do that, we also have to understand the evolution of the relationship. So how has Chinese presence in Latin America evolved since the turn of the century, and what are the main regions or areas of bilateral cooperation between Beijing and the regional countries?
No, that's a great question. So first of all, you're right. The relationship has evolved in many ways. And for me, although it's primarily about China pursuing its own economic interests and the benefit of that interest going to China, there still is a political component, a security component, and other components that I would say are becoming more important over time. So first of all, the evolution, although with China's global opening to the world that started with Deng Xiaoping, you saw an exponential increase in trade, usually buying commodities and selling its manufactured goods to all parts of the world, including Latin America. It really began to take off in trade terms when China was admitted to the World Trade Organization in 2001, I think formalized in 2002. However, even as that grew, what was going on behind the scenes was the establishment of relationships between business people, governments and others trying to get smart on what China was all about, building some of the financial and logistics and banking infrastructure needed to have a more, what I would call intimate presence. And then with the 2008 global financial crisis, you had the confluence of different events, which I think led to the next stage, which was China's physical presence on the ground in the region. And so you went from about $1 billion a year of Chinese investment in Latin America to about $10 billion per year, starting in about 2010. In some sectors, it was just a lot of big merger and acquisition activity, especially in petroleum and in mining. In other sectors, it had been building up little by little. Sectors like telecommunications with Huawei, or for example, in the electricity sector with companies like State Grid buying transmission and generation capability. But so with that new footprint on the ground, there was a lot of conflict in terms of social conflict with governments, problems with projects, but also immense learning opportunities. So the Chinese have gotten a lot smarter, although that learning continues. Now, if you look at the current state, so a decade after that presence on the ground, you see other types of evolution. Number one, with the evolution of the global economy, China has focused much more on energy, especially renewable energy, transmission capabilities, things like investing in hydroelectric facilities, wind, photovoltaic, even some nuclear, although that's been with problems. A lot of focus also on expanding its ability in the digital sector, not just telecommunications, but also cloud computing, surveillance architectures, e-commerce, et cetera, et cetera. And then along with that, part of the banking relationship, there's also a strategic movement to try to use its large transactions in bank swap arrangements to make the renminbi an international currency and get away from the dominance of the dollar. You see that in big transactions in places like Brazil and in Argentina, but also Venezuela. But you see it in other parts of the world, for example, with Saudi Arabia, among others. Now, having said that, there's also a increasing political framework. So, of course, the thing that China first kind of marketed itself to the world starting in 2013 was the Belt and Road Initiative. In Latin America, that started in about 2018 when Panama, which historically the region had never been part of the old Silk Road, but when Panama was included in the BRI, that signaled that Latin America could jump on the bandwagon. And so in the next 2 years, you had about 20 different countries get involved with that. But if you think of a table with 4 legs, the next leg that was added beyond BRI was the Global Development Initiative. And so in many ways, this is going back to China's South-South roots of marketing itself, not in terms of infrastructure, but by saying, hey, we as a fellow developing country want to make common cause with all of you. We understand you in a way that those developed countries don't. And so you see an increasing push on that. And then the other 2 legs of the table, the third is something called the Global Security Initiative. And importantly, the GSI is marketed very broadly. It's not only about military sales and interactions, but it's also about things like data architectures and standards and artificial intelligence. And also importantly, China explicitly has said in their GSI white paper, they want to work with institutions like CELAC, the Community of Latin American Caribbean States, and not the established security frameworks of, for example, the Inter-American system, like the Inter-American Defense Board or Inter-American Defense College, where the US, of course, has an important presence. And also, frankly, through BRICS, that was also mentioned. And so the GSI, in many ways, is looking to do an end run around established security arrangements with the U.S. at the table, and also it ties into the strategic role of things like its digital architectures and increasing domination of that space. And then, of course, the most recent addition, the 4th table leg, is the Global Civilization Initiative. On its face, this seems very likable because China says that we recognize there are different concepts of democracy, different concepts of human rights. The problem is that the way that China does this indirectly suggests that because there are all these concepts, it takes away from the idea that there's any one concept that is enforceable when somebody violates their own constitution or violates human rights or international law. So strategically, that is not only an appeal for illiberal states, but in many ways it implicitly attacks the rules-based international order that essentially the U.S. and Europe have constructed since the Bretton Woods Agreement and the Second World War. And so it's interesting to see how China's pursuit of its economic interest, increasingly in the kind of the digital and energy and in other more sophisticated technology spaces, is being built along with a framework that has security and political and other components, although China is still using a very soft touch as it does that. And so I'll stop there, but those are some of the most important evolutions that I've seen both in Latin America and also, frankly, consistent with the way China is doing this globally.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. That answer really shed some light on Chinese strategy on the continent that we don't think about. So that was very interesting. So one of the things that come up again and again is this very famous Strait of Malacca dilemma that China is grappling with and the need for hydrocarbons. So interestingly, I came across this article that spoke about what Iran is doing in Venezuela. So they are focusing on refineries and providing technological equipment. So my question was, do you think there is scope for China and Iran to cooperate in, particularly in hydrocarbons, in a way that might infringe on U.S. interest in the region?
Sure. So first of all, to put it in context, I would say that for me, China's economic strategic objectives really start with this idea of wanting secure access to the things that it needs to empower the Chinese economy, which include hydrocarbons, also include various strategic minerals, and also include foodstuffs for feeding the 1.4 million Chinese people, billion Chinese people. But in addition to that, it also includes secure access to markets and also the use of various different types of infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, but also electricity infrastructure, digital infrastructure, financial infrastructure, and working all of those three together. In that way, China tends to work with both liberal and illiberal states in different ways, and also to try to advance its interests by using presence in one area to reinforce others. Now, within that context, absolutely, petroleum is one of the things that China does need access to, even as it moves towards more electric based economy, which has to do, of course, with its separate efforts in places like Bolivia and Chile and Argentina and also Mexico to capture a role not only in access to lithium, but the whole lithium supply chain, because we often forget that in these areas, China doesn't just want the stuff, it wants the reliable access, and it wants to realize as much of the value added from that as is possible. Now, your question, and certainly the question of petroleum in Venezuela, I would point out that China has had difficulty in actually getting significant oil resources out of Venezuela. Even now, as Venezuela gets away from U.S. sanctions, China has the major presence along with Russia in Venezuela. The total amount is probably only a couple 100,000 barrels per day, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what China is doing, making lots of money with Iran, with Saudi Arabia and others, let alone also its oil arrangements in Brazil and elsewhere. Having said that, it goes to a broader issue, however, not only, and I should also mention Russia clearly, but there is also an informal kind of collaboration, strategic collaboration with what I would call illiberal states. To me, what's important is that China is not seeking a formal alliance because the goals of each of those illiberal states are very different. The goals of Iran are very different from the goals of Saudi Arabia, are very different from the goals of Russia. However, China recognizes that it can profit from the need of each of those illiberal states and the resources that it has. And so you have the situation where it is, buying Russian petroleum and foodstuffs at a great discount, whereas most of the rest of the world are putting on sanctions. It is doing major projects in Iran, also under sanctions regime. Now it's expanding that collaboration with Saudi Arabia for the same. Saudi Arabia also frustrated by pushback against some of its authoritarian government actions, and of course Venezuela. China tries not to get tainted by the more provocative or military actions of those illiberal states, but rather to basically profit from them. And at the same time, it recognizes that those the activities of those countries in many ways, because they distract or weaken the rules-based order and the United States and its allies, creates strategic space for the United States. And so China, for example, plays a difficult balancing game with Russia, trying not to be directly seen as an arms provider in a way that could lead to military repercussions against China, and yet trying to but yet benefiting from the way in which the United States and the West is spending billions and billions of dollars to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression, and China is learning a lot of things that it can apply if it ever decides to act against, Taiwan. So similar things with Iran, and you mentioned, for example, the Iran-Venezuela relationship with the visit by Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and his defense minister, I think just about 2 weeks ago, and again. China benefits from those things. There's also a synergy in that the Chinese money that helps regimes like Venezuela to be viable also gives them ability to have something to offer and sell when they want to deal with the Iranians in, for example, with petropowers and building up their, repairing their refinery and things like that. So there's lots of synergies, but it's still a very cautious game. But at the end of the day, it's a long strategic play in which China's empowerment of what I would call the illiberal counter order is probably the greatest collective threat that I would say to the rules-based, Western order and the concept of democracy that, we used to, with some excessive hubris, think that we had a monopoly on in the West. But I'll leave it at that.
Yes, Dr. Ellis, that explains a lot in the region. So one of the things that you spoke about was this strategic space, and China needs that to gain an strategic edge. So my question was, China has allegedly has had a secret agreement with Cuba to establish a spy base, quote unquote. So I wanted to ask about the implications of this agreement and what are the geopolitical dynamics that might be impacted because of this agreement.
Sure. So for those of us following the Cuba relationship, there were rumors, but never confirmed, that China had taken over since about 1999 operation of at least one electronic intelligence facility in Lourdes or Bejucal that used to be operated by the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, technology changes a lot over 30, 40 years, and so the presumption was that China brought in its own equipment as it used those facilities. And there was also some rumor that maybe other facilities in Cuba, maybe, for example, a computing facility in Santiago de Cuba. Having said that, when the issue was raised by the Wall Street Journal report right before Secretary Blinken's visit to the PRC, the Biden administration declassified some information indicating that, yes, the U.S. had known that at least since 2019, the Chinese had operated in Cuba with electronic intelligence gathering. And it appeared that around 2019, they had done some sort of upgrade to the facility, which makes sense. Now, and of course, there's the second chapter, which was another not yet confirmed Wall Street Journal report that the Chinese are also negotiating with Cuba to do some sort of training facility. Now, the implications, first of all, of the electronic intelligence, a number of different facilities, U.S. facilities are in that area. The headquarters for U.S. Southern Command, the headquarters and operations by U.S. Special Forces, SOCOM, as well as U.S. Central Command headquarters there in Tampa. In addition, you have major U.S. military air facilities, such as the one in Jacksonville. Of course, our major space launch site, Kennedy Center, is again in that area. And so there are any number of facilities that have sensitive electronic emissions, which give you ideas of what's going on, but also collecting electronic emissions from different warships and fighters, which can be used essentially in the future detection and going against those types of military assets. There is also some sense that if you have enough proximity, you may be able to intercept satellite signals that are aimed towards those facilities if you can also decrypt those satellites. So there are a number of different things that would basically give China important advantages, not only in wartime, but also in the preparation for a conflict with the United States. And clearly, if the United States were ever trying to send its forces to deploy or sustain to the Pacific, to the Indo-Pacific, then certainly the ability to have those facilities to observe there would be valuable. Beyond that, of course, the idea of having training facilities, whether it's just training or not, that also increases the possibility of military collaboration, and it increases options for under the guise of trainers having special teams for intel collection or basically operations that could be used to sabotage or otherwise act against those nearby U.S. facilities or even partner facilities, or do other types of things. And so there's a range of things. One can say, well, the U.S. does things in China, in Taiwan. Does China have a right or not? But it's one thing to talk about the morality of it, but it's another thing from the perspective of those of us who are charged with planning for the defense of the U.S. and in the region, thinking about strategically what that presence means in terms of what China can do and the threats that we would have to deal with in time of conflict. And so I think it certainly is on a lot of people's minds, the fact that you have those capabilities. And finally, it illustrates both that China is willing to take risks that it previously was not willing to take in terms of provoking or potentially provoking the United States. And it shows that Cuba, which remembers well the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, is also willing to take risks because it so much needs Chinese money as well as Iranian money and Russian money and others. It's willing to take risks to get that money to help keep its regime economically solvent. So both of those demonstrations of what those sides are willing to do and take risks do not bode well, in my judgment, for where things are going with Chinese engagement in the hemisphere or Cuban behavior in the hemisphere.
Professor Ellis, I would like to chime in here. Like you very fascinatingly put that 1962 Cuba Missiles crisis. So, like, what kind of preparedness that United States should have, rather than because Mexico is a friend and neighbor to the United States, that in foreseeable future we can say that it's not as harmful. And looking at the history of the Cuba, it's how much you see the strengthening of the communism of there, though the Cuba is already in crisis, in the internal crisis after the Fidel Castro regime.
Well, no, it's a great question. And for me, certainly, Cuba is economically probably in the worst shape. Probably Cuba has not been in this bad of shape since the withdrawal of the Soviet Union and its money, and with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union in 1993. You can see that in the number of refugees that are coming out of Cuba, and you could see previously, of course, with the 7 million Venezuelans that left Venezuela, the difficulties that they have there. However, when authoritarian regimes are not willing to negotiate power, it's one thing to have economic crisis that can force mass suffering of your people and mass outmigration. That does not mean that there will be a change. So having said that, for me, the issue is not so much about communism or not, but essentially that you have regimes that their political orientation is very hostile to the United States by definition, and willing to collaborate with a range of extra hemispheric rivals, China, Russia, Iran, and in others, in that way serve as what I would call threat hosts that bring in the possibility of those even more substantial threats into the region in time of conflict. Beyond that, the question of what some of the things we should be prepared for are, and again, oftentimes we look at it from a peacetime lens, and nobody wants war, and I don't think that the actual prospects of war, even over Taiwan, are that high, but they're certainly not zero, and they've certainly gotten greater with the aggressiveness of Xi Jinping in his third period in office. I think, in my opinion, he very much, as other U.S. government officials have said, very much wants to resolve this issue as part of his legacy of his term in office that would put him, on the standing with Mao Zedong, among other, great Chinese leaders. So, expecting that, those of us who are responsible for thinking about the defense of the U.S. have to think, well, if there were a war, whether you desire one or not, what could we expect? And I think, number one, China's economic might means that the U.S. cannot automatically expect access to partner airspace or partner facilities or military cooperation, even like we are receiving now, that certain actors in the name of economic benefits and Chinese pressure would be reluctant to provide that. Number two, to anticipate that Chinese and perhaps others helping the Chinese, especially in wartime, maybe the Cubans, maybe the Venezuelans or others, would be looking to provide the collection of militarily relevant information and other information on U.S. deployment, on sustainment, and would possibly seek to operate from both commercial as well as other facilities in the region to try to sabotage those, and perhaps even sabotage some partners. For example, without naming countries, there are some partners who would likely not heed Chinese implicit threats to not cooperate with the United States. Those partners would then in wartime become basically targets, whether it was Chinese cyber attacks or Chinese economic attacks and others. And so, the U.S. has to think about, also helping to protect its partners in those wartime scenarios. As you get farther into a wartime scenario, you have to think also about that you mentioned the Straits of Malacca, very much of importance to China. And of course, as China has moved out, also the second, major geographic logistics choke point, Suez Canal, where the Chinese very closely you have the base in Djibouti. But certainly for China, the question of how you close down U.S. usable maritime choke points in the West. So, the Panama Canal, for those of us who remember how easy it was to shut down the Suez Canal with a container ship, going sideways, and there are many ways that the Panama Canal can be shut down despite its government, which then takes you to the secondary transit around the south of Argentina, usually through the Straits of Magellan. So in that sense, the Chinese location of a supposedly private port in actually Tierra del Fuego, near Tierra del Fuego, even though it has nothing to do with the Argentine government, creates certain risks. And so overall, the point is, and it also gets into the question of dual use facilities, such as, for example, the Chinese operated port in Chancay, which is going to be operational in 2024, 15 berth deep water port. And to me, the lesson of that, it's not that it would be an explicit military base like Djibouti, but for example, I'm sure those in the Indo-Pacific remember that when China got control of the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, aside from the story of how that happened, but when China then wanted to come in with its electronic intelligence gathering warship and saying, hey, we want to put into port, because the Chinese were the port operator and the Sri Lankan government was economically dependent, they were in a difficult position to say no. And so in a wartime scenario, it's not a question of just bases, it's a question of facilities with dependent governments in Chinese operated ports that could receive and provide military support, especially in places that we in the US would call the Eastern Pacific, far enough away from the US mainland to be survivable, and yet close enough from which the Chinese can present some very significant military risks from the Western Hemisphere in ways that you're not used to seeing. And so again, this is not to say that, this is what people in the US expect to happen. But again, it's the job of responsible military actors, both in China and the United States, to plan for what a war might look like. And as one does that planning, the actions in the commercial space and in these other spaces create some very significant risks that really increase the threats that we've had to consider previously.
Thank you. That's really, really insightful. Go ahead, Arushi.
Yes, sir. If I may, as we are discussing the Cuban invasion, a lot of focus has been on the possibility of this invasion of Taiwan by China, of course. So one of the things that is very interesting is this war footing of China in regards to the diplomatic front. So a lot of countries have been breaking ties with Taiwan. So one of the most recent ones was Honduras. So recently they have opened an embassy in Beijing. So my question was, what do you think the impact of this decision was?
That's a great question. So first of all, one has to understand the impact strategically in the context of China's broader struggle to isolate Taiwan, and then of course the impact at the country level, and both are really significant. So in general, I think what one can see is that China oftentimes, like with its pursuit of dethroning the dollar and introducing the renminbi, these are oftentimes gradual campaigns pursued over long periods of time. It's not necessarily that China thinks quite as millennially willy-nilly, as people like to think, but certainly China does have the habit of having long-standing national objectives that it works towards, and sometimes it has to try something and then try something else working in that direction. And so one of those key things certainly is the recuperation of territory that China perceives as should be belonging to it. And certainly Hong Kong was one of those territories, and certainly Taiwan is even more importantly one of those territories because of the legacy of the retreat of nationalists to Formosa and the continuing defiance of symbolically PRC sovereignty. Having said that, thus the idea of to me, one track is the preparation for some sort of military interaction, and it's not necessarily that it would be just an invasion, but perhaps presenting such overwhelming force that the Taiwanese would believe that there was no point in fighting. That's very kind of classic Sun Tzu, if you will. But another part of that is the sense that your enemies are or your adversaries are isolated and surrounded, and so basically eliminating Taiwan's remaining internationally recognizing actors are part of that isolation. And so again, it doesn't mean that China will wait until Taiwan has zero international recognizers before a military action, but just to recognize that as Taiwan moves towards zero and as moves towards the international community not giving strong signals that it can and will defend it, then that increases Taiwan's desperation and the sense that it has to submit, but it also increases PRC confidence that it can act boldly. And so as you move towards zero, and of course the recognition by Honduras previously in December 2021, the move by Nicaragua, and now there are others on the table. So you have even now the new one of the leading presidential candidates in Guatemala, Arevalo, talking about possible change. You had some noises by the Prime Minister of, I believe it was St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You have some possibility in Haiti. And so little by little, moving towards that kind of Taiwan zero status. But aside from its impact on Chinese actions in Asia, it also impacts China's influence in the countries in which those go forward. So typically there is a playbook, and you can see it going back to the Costa Rica's recognition in 2007. You could see it when those flips were renewed after the end of the diplomatic truce between the PRC and ROC in 2016, when in quick succession you had the recognition by the Varela government in Panama, and then governments in the Dominican Republic and in El Salvador, et cetera, et cetera. But in each case, typically you will have a delegation that will go over. They will sign a lot of non-transparent MOUs. You will take key business people over. Now, the business people will not result in a significant long-term trade benefit, because frankly, what those regions have to sell, fruit, other perishable goods, it just doesn't make sense for their small amount of undifferentiated goods to be transported halfway around the world in expensive refrigerated containers when the PRC can get the same thing from Vietnam, from the Philippines, from elsewhere. But what happens is that those well-connected business leaders get special deals for their export products, which basically buys them into this. The MOUs typically open up local markets for things like telecommunications and infrastructure projects. There's usually a symbolic gift, sometimes a stadium, sometimes something else. But again, it opens up the door to construction companies. Typically, there's a Confucius Institute that creates a bridgehead for reaching out to the elites in that area. Typically, there is a training arrangement because these smaller countries will have very little familiarity with China in terms of, so they, in the interest of helping the country to educate their foreign affairs establishment on how to work with China, they will offer training programs, which again gives the PRC access to the highest levels of government of these countries. And the list goes on and on. But the bottom line is that anytime that you have one of these flips, it is associated through the MOUs with this rapid increase in PRC influence in opportunities and penetration. And then, frankly, everything that happens in one country is closely watched by other countries which are considering a flip. And so every, so to speak, move on the chessboard impacts how the game is played elsewhere. And so strategically, it's not only important in Asia, but it's also important in what's going on in terms of PRC influence. And frankly, because so many of these governments are now so close to the United States, that the majority, with the exception of Paraguay, are either in Central America or in the Caribbean, all very close to U.S. shore. And so this rapid expansion of PRC influence and options is occurring in that part of Latin America, which is physically closest and strategically most delicate for the United States. And so that's another point.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. That really illustrated Chinese actions. So one of the things that a lot of experts are talking about is this, like it originates from this quote. It basically says that China invests in mines, the West should invest in mines. However, as right-wing populism is rising in the US and Europe, do you think this is possible? This free exchange of ideas, or even this free exchange of movement of people?
First of all, you make a very good point that at the core of responding to the challenge of China's advance, it has to be a question of values. But it's one thing to say, let's talk about values. That doesn't necessarily mean that one talks about values in an effective way, because it's a very, as you know, complex space. So part of the problem in terms of influence, most people in Latin America recognize that there are aspects of China that are problematic, whether it's treatment of its own people, the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, the crushing of democracy in Hong Kong, its activities, its military threats towards Taiwan, the militarization of the South and East China Sea. That's understood. Indeed, the predatory nature of Chinese companies is often understood in Latin America. Part of the problem, unfortunately, is sometimes cognitive dissonance, desire to say, well, we want to get the benefit, and we believe that we can control the risk, and so we'll say it's just business. And so that creates a bit of a trap, because it means that the people who are most knowledgeable to understand the risks of the Chinese system and help their governments to coordinate against them are oftentimes silenced in selective ways in the interest of pursuing that benefit. But a couple other points I think it's important. Number one is understanding that there are certain, although the Chinese do not trumpet the virtues of their system, although they are increasingly vocal about something to be learned from China's example, but it is still clear, even if the Chinese are not saying it, that even if at great costs, the Chinese have brought something like 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years, and also it's new applications of information technology, even though it really violates some sensitive issues of personal privacy and other rights. It is perceived as bringing about a lot of economic efficiency, maybe a certain level of security and other things. And so for a Latin America, which sometimes does not see Western-style democracy as having brought some of the results that it had hoped for. The Chinese example seems to suggest, well, if you're willing to give up some privacy rights and adopt this approach to technology, if you're willing to allow the state to have some role, maybe it's not all just about private industry. And so that example impacts the debate. And I grew up during the Cold War in the 1970s and 1980s. And at that time, even though the Soviet Union had and Warsaw Pact had people's democratic republics and talked about the advances of communism, one could just look at the vibrancy of free market economies and the difference between what the Soviet Union called democracy and the West called democracy, and there was a clear difference. I think part of the danger now is that in the new discourse, with some problems of polarization, especially in the internet era, in which there are sincere doubts in especially in some of the places where democracy has not brought fruits, and at the same time clear examples of what would appear to be successes of China. It really complicates that value proposition. The difficulty, however, is that the Chinese in many ways are putting forth concepts that isn't presenting an alternative that can be evaluated, but in many ways an alternative that effectively disarms a value proposition which is in the way of China advancing its own. So we're really not having a conversation about what the values actually are. We're having, so for example, the Global Civilization Initiative saying, well, we believe there's lots of concepts of democracy and lots of concepts for human rights, but effectively by saying, okay, well, we don't want to talk about human rights, or we want to talk about human rights without criticizing anybody on human rights. At the end of the day, that takes us back to the world that philosopher Thomas Hobbes in the West used to talk about, in which, the Leviathan, he who is stronger, basically gets his way, whether that's a military or a state. And then just to conclude on this piece, because I am also a big believer in this idea that we can't be just transactional. We can't just say, let's, China offers you a bridge, we'll offer you a bridge. The Western capitalist democratic system does not have the agility or the mobilization of private sector capital to be able to move in that way. We'll never beat China at that game. At the end of the day, it has to be about the region saying what you want to do. It's not because the U.S. says, but because it's in your own interest. And I think we have a lot more to do there to convince the region, really through data and examples and things that even whether you call it democracy or not, that things like good governance, things like good project planning, things like competent evaluation of competing bids, enforcement of laws equally with all players, not allowing Chinese or others to cut corners, things like insisting on transparency so that what you actually get is in the interest of the country's development and not just for me, the win-win is often the Chinese elites win and the local elites who sign the deal and get the special deal for their brother-in-law, sister's family win, but the people, like always, end up not winning. And so really kind of to make that argument more effectively that it's not just about whether you turn away the Chinese money that you need for your development. It's about, are you doing these things with transparency and good planning so that your country will actually benefit from these things? And so to me, those are the type of value discussions that we need to have. And finally, part of the challenge is also that the availability of Chinese money makes that conversation very, very delicate, because as we're seeing right now, when the United States says, okay, you're not a democracy, you're not doing this with human rights, illiberal actors say, okay, well, we'll just turn to the Chinese for the money. We don't need to listen to this. And so while I'm a big believer that the Western world has to lead with values, basically value shaming does not work in a world in which you have another actor with a lot of money and who imposes few value conditions. And so I think we have to conduct that value discourse much more intelligently, much more flexibly, in a way that emphasizes the long-term interests of our partners, rather than just try to sell the values as things that are just so inherent and obvious that, while of course the world will want them, because I think the world has not yet had a positive experience with that. And so we need to do a better job in selling why some of these things are in the interest of those who are adopting the values.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. That was an amazingly comprehensive answer, and I really appreciate it. So, you mentioned alternatives. So, once upon a time, or so I've heard, that the IMF and the World Bank, they used to strike fear in the hearts of officials and politicians. But now China provides an alternative, and countries are really trying to negotiate the loans with the IMF, but still some countries do go to China. So, how have these loans created leverage for China? And more importantly, how are they going to impact the long-term policies of these debtor countries? And just a short note, like another question basically, do you think US and its allies, can they counter these various economic permutations?
Great question. So first of all, important to recognize that the Chinese are in all of those financial spaces. And so, they actually are in places like, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank, where they've been on the board since, I believe, February 2009. Actually, the IADB with China has set up a number of co-financing funds, and oftentimes Chinese companies will position themselves to capture, IADB, loans. And so it's not just the big Chinese policy banks like China Development Bank. And also, it's it's important to recognize that some of that policy bank approach itself is shifting. And so especially when you had big populist countries like Venezuela who are willing to take massive amounts of policy bank loans, and there wasn't a recognition of the level of risk involved in the repayment. Basically, the same lesson that Western development banks learned 10, 20, 30 years before. And so what's happened in that context is that the level of lending of China Development Bank, China Exim Bank has trailed off a little bit, at least with the loss of key recipients like Venezuela, although with the return of Lula da Silva in Brazil and others, that could be coming back. But there also is a shift to more commercial lending, basically public-private partnership loans in which essentially big Chinese industrial conglomerates like China Harbor or others are essentially self-financing major projects, but not necessarily kind of government to government in the traditional fashion. And so understanding how that's evolving as well. The question of what the U.S. can do, and clearly a lot of the U.S. tools need to be rethought. And so, the issue of, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank, which is supposed to be a counter to China with good, economically, corporate social responsibility, high level, loans. And yet, so number one, how do you ensure that the very institutions which are supposed to be alternatives to China do not end up becoming co-opted by China themselves? Number two, others, for example, the Development Finance Corporation, which was basically conceived in the previous administration to be a more large-scale, more agile, build on to the U.S. Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, and US Exim. But unfortunately, anytime that you have something that's important and good, all of the desirable political conditions start getting piled onto it. And so, now, DFC tries to say, okay, we are going to only target lesser income countries. We are going to especially try to target environmentally responsible projects, especially those in the green energy sector. If possible, we're going to try to target projects that benefit historically disadvantaged groups and minorities, and all of these things are good. But the dilemma is that China is out to economically win, whereas the U.S. is trying to do 60 different things to do good, and that is undercut the scale and the agility with which DFC, for example, can present alternatives. Another one of the pieces, frankly, also is that the U.S. With the polarization in Washington, with split control of Congress, things like, for example, legislation for a Build Back Better World, which was supposed to bring a lot of new money to the table, which could then be used to compete. With that having difficulty getting through in Washington, then again, the ability to compete without putting money on the table, whatever the institution is yet another problem. Although, again, I've seen a lot of thinking being done about that. Even USAID, for example, has a part of its organization where it doesn't just think about how to, improve people's lives, but along the way, how we can push back against some of the more predatory aspects of China. So there is lots of creative thinking, I think, happening. But I would say it clearly is a complex and an evolving picture. And then finally, it is important to note that although it's easy to make China the 10-foot giant, clearly there is enormous debt overhang, both at the national level, at the corporate level, and in terms of Chinese localities. The Chinese economy right now is not coming back quite as quickly after the end of zero COVID. And frankly, a lot of those bad loans, maybe as much as 30% of the $1 trillion in Belt and Road Initiative loans, especially in Central Asia and Central and Eastern Europe, have not gone through. And so a lot of that experience with bad loans, I would say, has caused Chinese banks to be a little bit more cautious than they used to, especially in the current economic environment. So although I think we still continue to have a very serious problem that we need to get our own institutions better funded and unbroken for, I think the China's move forward will, at least in the financial domain, be somewhat restricted by some of these internal problems and issues of their own past.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis, for sharing your knowledge and time with us today. I will now hand over to Dr. Saxena for closing remarks.
Thank you, Arushi, and thank you, Professor Ellis. It's really wonderful, and in real in real meaning, it's in the framework of the cost and benefit analysis. And thank you so much for your time and your participation. And please note down the audience here that the views expressed and presented are personal, should not be constituted to any organization and institutions. Thanks again, and we look forward to many more talks and discussions in the future with you, Professor Ellis.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being on the program and an honor.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.